are you? Today we're reading Tom Sawyer. I want to start by reading the preface that Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, himself wrote to tell us about this book. Most of the adventures recorded in this book really occurred. One or two of them were experiences of my own. The rest of them were boys who were schoolmates of mine. Huck Finn is drawn from life. Tom Sawyer also is, but not from one individual. He's a combination of the characteristics of three boys whom I knew about 30 or 40 years ago. So he would be meaning about 1830s, 1840s. Although my book is intended mainly for the entertainment of children, I hope it will not be shunned by adults on that account, for part of my plan has been to try to pleasantly remind adults of what they once were themselves, of how they felt and thought and talked, and what weird enterprises they sometimes engaged in. Chapter 1 starts with someone shouting, "Tom!" No answer. "Tom!" No answer. What's gone with that boy, I wonder? "Yo, Tom!" No answer. The old lady being Aunt Polly. The old lady pulled her spectacles down and looked over them about the room. Then she put them up and looked out under them. She seldom or never looked through them, for so small a thing as a boy. They were her fashionable pair, the pride of her heart. They were built for style, not for service. She could have seen through a pair of stove lids just as well. She looked perplexed for a moment and then said, not fiercely, but loud enough for the furniture to hear, "Well, if I lay my hands on you, She didn't finish, for by this time she was bending down and punching under the bed with a broom, and so she needed breath to punctuate the punches with. She resurrected nothing but the cat. I never did see the beat of that boy. She went to the open door and stood in it and looked out among the tomato vines and the weeds that constituted the garden. No Tom. So she lifted up her voice at an angle calculated for distance, and she shouted, "Tom!" There was a slight noise behind her, and she turned just in time to seize a small boy by the nape of his neck and stop his flight. "There! I should have thought of that closet. What have you been doing in there?" "Nothing. Nothing. Look at your hands. Look at your mouth. What is all that?" "I don't know, Auntie." "Well, I know. It's jam. That's what it is. 40 times I've said, if you didn't let that jam alone, I'd skin you. Hand me that switch." The switch hovered in the air. The peril was desperate. The boy said, "Aunt, look behind you." Aunt Polly turned. She whirled around and snatched her skirts out of danger. The boy fled in an instant. He scrambled over the fence and disappeared over it. His Aunt Polly stood surprised for a moment, and then she broke into a laugh. "Hang that boy. Can't I never learn anything? Ain't he played me tricks enough like that for me to be looking out for him by this time? Old fools is the biggest fools there is. You can't learn an old dog new tricks, as the saying is, but my goodness, he never plays 'em alike 2 days. And how's a body to know what's coming? He appears to know just how long he can torment me before I get my dander up, and he knows he can make out to put me off for a minute or make me laugh, and then it's all down again and I can't hit him a lick. I ain't doing my duty by that boy, and that's the Lord's truth, goodness knows. Spare the rod and spoil the child, as the good book says. I'm a laying up sin and suffering for us both. I know. He's full of the old scratch, but laws of me, he's my own dead sister's boy, poor thing, and I ain't got the heart to lash him somehow. Every time I let him off, my conscience, it does hurt me so. And every time I hit him, my old heart most breaks. Well, a man that is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble, as the scripture says, and I reckon it's so. He played hooky this evening, and I'll be obliged to make him work tomorrow to punish him. It's mighty hard to make him work on Saturdays when all the other boys is having holidays, but he hates work more than he hates anything else, and I gotta do something of my duty by him, or I'll be the ruination of that child." Tom did play hooky, and he had a very good time. He got back home barely in time to help Jim, the small colored boy, sawing the next day's wood and splitting the kindlings for supper. At least he was there in time to tell his adventures to Jim, while Jim did 3/4 of the work. Tom's younger brother, well, his half-brother Sid, was already through with his part of the work, picking up the chips, for he was a quiet boy and had no adventurous, troublesome ways. While Tom was eating his supper and stealing sugar as the opportunity offered, Aunt Polly asked him questions that were full of guile and very deep, for she wanted to trap him into damaging revealments. Like many other simple-hearted souls, it was her pet vanity to believe she was endowed with a talent for dark and mysterious diplomacy, and she loved to contemplate her most transparent devices as marvels of low cunning. Said she, "Tom, it was middling warm in school, warn't it?" "Yes'm." "Powerful warm, warn't it?" "Yes'm." "Didn't you want to go swimming, Tom?" A bit of a scare shot through Tom, a touch of uncomfortable suspicion. He searched Aunt Polly's face, but it told him nothing, so he said, "No, not very much." The old lady reached out her hand and felt Tom's shirt and said, "But you ain't too warm now, though." And it flattered her to reflect that she had discovered his shirt was dry, without anybody knowing that that was what she had in her mind. But in spite of her, Tom knew where the wind lay now, so he forestalled what might be the next move. "Yeah, some of us pumped water over our heads. Mine's damp yet, you see." Aunt Polly was vexed to think she'd overlooked that bit of circumstantial evidence, and she missed a trick. Then she had a new inspiration. "Tom, you didn't have to undo your shirt collar where I sewed it in order to pump that water over your head, did you? Unbutton your jacket." The trouble vanished out of Tom's face. He opened his jacket. His shirt collar was securely sewed. "Bother," said Aunt Polly. "Well, go along with you. I was sure you'd played hooky and been a swimming, but I forgive you, Tom. I reckon you're kind of a singed cat, as the saying goes. You're better'n you look, this time." She was half sorry her sagacity had miscarried and half glad that Tom had stumbled into obedient conduct for once. But Sid said, "Well, now, if I didn't think you sewed his collar with white thread, but now it's black." "Why, I did sew it with white," says Aunt Polly. "Tom." But Tom didn't wait for the rest. As he went out the door, he said, "Sid, I'm going to lick you for that." In a safe place, Tom examined the two large needles that were thrust into his jacket and had thread bound around them. One needle had white thread and the other black. He said, "She would never have noticed that if it hadn't been for Sid. Confound it. Sometimes she sews it with white and sometimes she sews it with black. I wish to Jiminy she'd stick to one or the other. I can't keep the run of them. But I bet you I'll lamb Sid for that. I'll learn him." Within 2 minutes or even less, he'd forgotten all his troubles. Not because his troubles were one whit less heavy or bitter to him than a man's are to a man, but because a new and powerful interest bore them down and drove them out of his mind for the time, just as men's misfortunes are forgotten in the excitement of new enterprises. This new interest was a valued novelty in whistling, and he was suffering to practice it undisturbed. It consisted in a peculiar bird-like tone, a sort of liquid warble. Sorry, I can't whistle. Produced by touching the tongue to the roof of the mouth at short intervals in the midst of the music. The reader probably remembers how to do it if you've ever been a boy or a girl. Diligence and attention soon gave him the knack of it, and he strode down the street with his mouth full of harmony and his soul full of gratitude. He felt much as an astronomer feels who's discovered a new planet. No doubt, as far as strong, deep, unalloyed pleasure is concerned, the advantage was with the boy, not the astronomer. The summer evenings were long. It was not dark yet. Presently Tom checked his whistle. A stranger was before him, a boy a shade larger than himself. A newcomer of any age or either sex was an impressive curiosity in the poor little shabby village of St. Petersburg. This boy was well-dressed, too, well-dressed on a weekday. This was simply astounding. His cap was a dainty thing. His close-buttoned blue cloth jacket was new and natty, and so were his pants. He had shoes on, and it was only Friday. He even wore a necktie, a bright bit of ribbon. He had a citified air about him that ate into Tom's vitals. The more Tom stared at that splendid marvel, the higher he turned up his nose at his finery, and the shabbier his own outfit seemed to him to grow. Neither boy spoke. If one moved, the other moved, but only sideways, in a circle. They kept face to face and eye to eye all the time. Finally, Tom said, "I can lick you. I'd like to see you try it." "Well, I can do it." "You can't neither." "Yes, I can." "No, you can't." "I can." "You can't." "Can." An uncomfortable pause. Then Tom said, "What's your name?" "'Tisn't any of your business, maybe." "Well, I allow I'll make it my business." "Well, why don't you?" "If you say much, I will." "Much." 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 "There now." "Oh, you think you're mighty smart, don't you? I could lick you with one hand tied behind me if I wanted to." "Well, why don't you do it?" "You say you can do it." "Well, I will if you fool with me." "Oh, yes, I seen whole families in the same fix." Smarty, you think you're some now, don't you? What a hat. You can lump that hat if you don't like it. I dare you to knock it off. And anybody who will take a dare will suck eggs. You're a liar. You're another. You're a fighting liar and doesn't take it up. I take a walk. Say, if you give me much more of your sass, I'll take and bounce a rock off your head. Oh, yeah, of course you will. I will. Well, why don't you do it then? What do you keep saying you will for? Why don't you do it? It's because you're afraid. I ain't afraid. You are. I ain't. You are. Another pause, and more eyeing and sidling around each other. Presently, they were shoulder to shoulder. Tom said, "Get away from here. Go away yourself." "I won't. I won't either." So they stood, each with a foot placed at an angle as a brace, and both shoving with might and main and glowering at each other with hate. But neither could get an advantage. After struggling till both were hot and flushed, each relaxed his strain with watchful caution. And Tom said, "You're a coward and a pup. I'll tell my big brother on you. He can thrash you with his little finger, and I'll make him do it too. What do I care for your big brother? I got a big brother that's bigger than he is, and what's more, he can throw him over that fence." Both of these brothers, mind you, are imaginary. That's a lie. Your saying so doesn't make it so. Tom drew a line in the dust with his big toe and said, "I dare you to step over that, and I'll lick you till you can't stand up. Anybody that take a dare will steal sheep." The new boy stepped over the line promptly and said, "Now you said you'd do it. Let's see you do it." "Don't you crowd me now. You better look out." "Well, you said you'd do it. Why don't you do it?" "By jingo, for 2 cents, I will do it." The new boy took 2 broad copper pennies out of his pocket, and he held them out with derision. Tom struck them to the ground. In an instant, both boys were rolling and tumbling in the dirt, gripped together like cats, and for the space of a minute, they tugged and tore at each other's hair and clothes. They punched and scratched each other's noses. They covered themselves with dust and glory. Presently, the confusion took form, and through the fog of battle, Tom appeared, seated astride the new boy, pounding him with his fists. "Holler enough," he said. The boy only struggled to free himself. He was crying, mainly from rage. "Holler enough!" And the pounding went on. At last the stranger got out a smothered "Nuff!" and Tom led him up and said, "Now that'll learn you. Better look out who you're fooling with next time." The new boy went off, brushing the dust from his clothes, sobbing, snuffling, and occasionally looking back and shaking his head and threatening what he would do to Tom the next time he caught him out. To which Tom responded with jeers and started off in high feather. As soon as his back was turned, the new boy snatched up a stone and threw it and hit him between the shoulders, and then turned tail and ran like an antelope. Tom chased the traitor home and thus found out where he lived. He then held a position at the gate for some time, daring the enemy to come outside. But the enemy only made faces at him through the window and declined. At last, the enemy's mother appeared and called Tom a bad, vicious, vulgar child and ordered him away. So he went away, but he said he allowed to lay for that boy. He got home pretty late that night, and when he climbed cautiously in at the window, he uncovered an ambush in the person of his aunt. When she saw the state his clothes were in, her resolution to turn his Saturday holiday into captivity at hard labor became adamant in its firmness. Saturday morning was come, and all the summer world was bright and fresh and brimming with life. There was a song in every heart, and if the heart was young, the music issued from the lips. There was cheer in every face and a spring in every step. The locust trees were in bloom. The fragrance of the blossoms filled the air. Everywhere was green with vegetation, and it seemed to be a delectable land, dreamy, reposeful, and inviting. Tom appeared on the sidewalk with a bucket of whitewash and a long-handled brush. He surveyed the fence, and all the gladness left him, and a deep melancholy settled down upon his spirit. 30 yards of board fence, 9 feet high. Life to him seemed hollow, and existence but a burden. Sighing, he dipped his brush and passed it along the topmost plank. He repeated the operation. He did it again and compared the insignificant whitewashed street with the far-reaching continent of unwhitewashed fence, and sat down on a tree box, discouraged. Jim came skipping out at the gate with a tin pail, singing, "Buffalo gals, won't you come out tonight, come out tonight, come out tonight." Bringing water from the town pump had always been hateful work in Tom's eyes, but now it did not strike him so. He remembered that there was company at the pump. Other children were always waiting their turns, resting, trading toys, quarreling, fighting. And he remembered that although the pump was only 150 yards away, Jim never got back with a bucket of water in under an hour. And even then, generally somebody had to go get him. So Tom said, "Hey, Jim, I'll fetch the water if you'll whitewash some." Jim shook his head and said, "I can't, Tom. The old missus told me I got to get this water and not fool around with anybody. She said she expect that Tom's going to ask me to whitewash, and she told me to go along and tend to my own business. She allowed she'd tend to the whitewashing." "Oh, don't you mind what she said, Jim. That's the way she always talks. Give me the bucket. I'll only be gone a minute. She will never know." "Tom, I won't do it, Tom. The old missus, she'd take and tar the head off me. That she would." She never licks anybody. She whacks them over the head with her thimble, and who cares for that, I'd like to know. She talks awful, but talk don't hurt. Anyways, it don't if she don't cry. Jim, I'll give you a marvel. I'll give you a white alley." Jim began to waver. "White alley, Jim. I'll show you my sore toe." Jim was only human. This attraction was too much for him. He put down his pail and he bent over the toe with absorbing interest while the bandage was being unwound. In another moment, he was flying down the street with his pail and a tingling backside. Tom was whitewashing with vigor, and Aunt Polly was retiring from the field with a slipper in her hand and triumph in her eye. But Tom's energy didn't last. He began to think of the fun he'd planned for that day, and his sorrows multiplied. Soon all the other boys would come tripping along on all sorts of delicious expeditions, and they would make a world of fun of him for having to work. The very thought of it burnt him like fire. He got out his worldly wealth and examined it. Bits of toys and marbles and trash, enough to buy an exchange of work, maybe, but not half enough to buy so much as half an hour of pure freedom. So he returned his straitened means to his pocket and gave up the idea of trying to buy the boys. At this dark and hopeless moment, an inspiration burst upon him, nothing less than a great, magnificent inspiration. He took up his brush, and he went tranquilly to work. Ben Rogers came in sight presently, the very boy of all boys whose ridicule he'd been dreading. Ben's gait was the hop, skip, and jump, proof enough that his heart was light and his anticipations high. He was eating an apple and giving a long melodious whoop at intervals, followed by a ding-dong-dong, ding-dong-dong, for he was impersonating the big Missouri, a steamboat, and considered himself to be drawing 9 feet of water. He was boat and captain and engine bells combined. So he had to imagine himself standing on his own hurricane deck, giving orders and executing them. Meanwhile, Tom went on whitewashing, paying no attention to the steamboat. Ben stared a moment and then said, "Hey, you're up a stump, aren't you?" No answer. Tom surveyed his last touch with the eye of an artist, and then he gave the brush another gentle sweep and surveyed the results as before. Ben ranged up alongside of him. Tom's mouth was watering for that apple, but he stuck to his work. Ben said, "Hey, old chap, you gotta work, don't you?" Tom wheeled suddenly and said, "Oh, why, it's you, Ben. I didn't notice you." "Say," says Ben, "I'm going swimming." "I am? Don't you wish you could?" "Oh, but of course you'd rather work, wouldn't you? Of course you would." Tom contemplated the boy a bit and said, "What do you call work?" "Why, ain't that work?" Tom resumed his whitewashing and answered carelessly, "Well, maybe it is and maybe it ain't. All I know is it suits Tom Sawyer." "Oh, come now, you don't mean to let on you like it." The brush continued to move. "Like it? Well, I don't see why I wouldn't like it. Does a boy get a chance to whitewash a fence every day?" That put the thing in a new light. Ben stopped nibbling his apple. Tom swept his brush daintily back and forth. He stepped back to note the effect again, Ben watching every move and getting more and more interested, more and more absorbed. Presently he said, "Hey, Tom, let me whitewash a little." Tom considered. He was about to consent, but he altered his mind. No, I reckon it wouldn't hardly do, Ben. You see, Aunt Polly's awful particular about this fence, right here on this street, mind you. But if it was the back fence, I wouldn't mind and she wouldn't. Yeah, she's awful particular about this fence. It's got to be done very carefully, and I reckon there ain't one boy in 1,000, maybe 2,000 that can do it the way it's got to be done. "No, is that so? Oh, come on. Just let me try. Only just for a little while. I'd let you if it was me, Tom." "Ben, I'd like to. Honestly, I would. But Aunt Polly, well, Jim wanted to do it and she wouldn't let him. Sid wanted to do it. She wouldn't let Sid. Now, how do you think I'm fixed? If you was to tackle this fence and anything was to happen to, oh, shucks, I'll be just as careful, said Ben. Now, let me try. Say, I'll give you half my apple. Now, here, Ben, no, I'm afraid. I'll give you all my apple. Tom gave up the brush with reluctance in his face, but alacrity in his heart. And while the late riverboat steamer, the Big Missouri, worked and sweated in the sun, the retired artist sat on a barrel in the shade close by, dangled his legs, munched his apple, and planned the slaughter of more innocents. There was no lack of material. Boys happened along every little while. They came to jeer, but remained to whitewash. By the time Ben was worn out, Tom had traded the next chance to Billy Fisher for a kite in good repair. And when he played out, Johnny Miller brought in for a dead rat and a string to swing it with, and so on, hour after hour. And when the middle of the afternoon came, far from being a poor, poverty-stricken boy in the morning, Tom was literally rolling in wealth. He had, besides the things just mentioned, 12 marbles, part of a Jew's harp, a piece of blue bottle glass to look through, a spool cannon, a key that wouldn't unlock anything, a fragment of chalk, a glass stopper of a decanter, a tin soldier, a couple of tadpoles, 6 firecrackers, a kitten with only one eye, a brass doorknob, a dog collar, but no dog, the handle of a knife, 4 pieces of orange peel, and a dilapidated old window sash. He had a nice, good, idle time all the while and plenty of company, and the fence now had 3 coats of whitewash on it. If he hadn't run out of whitewash, he would have bankrupted every boy in the village. Tom said to himself that it was not such a hollow world after all. He discovered a great law of human action without knowing it, namely, that in order to make a person covet a thing, it's only necessary to make the thing difficult to attain. If he'd been a great and wise philosopher, like the writer of this book, he would now have comprehended that work consists of what a body is obliged to do. Play consists of what a body is not obliged to do. And this would help him to understand why constructing artificial flowers or performing on a treadmill is work, while rolling 10 pins or climbing Mount Blanc is only amusement. The boy mused a while over the substantial change which had taken place in his worldly circumstances, and then wended toward headquarters to report. Tom presented himself before Aunt Polly, who was sitting by an open window in a pleasant rearward apartment, which was bedroom, breakfast room, dining room, and library combined. The balmy summer air, the restful quiet, the odor of the flowers, and the drowsing murmur of the bees had their effect, and she was nodding over her knitting, for she had no company but the cat, and it was asleep in her lap. Her spectacles were propped up on her gray head for safety. She had thought that, of course, Tom had deserted long ago, and she wondered at seeing him place himself in her power again in this intrepid way. He said, "May I go and play now, Aunt?" "What, already? How much have you done?" "Oh, it's all done, Aunt." "Tom, don't lie to me. I can't bear it." "No, I ain't, Aunt. It's all done." Aunt Polly placed small trust in such evidence. She went out to see for herself, and she would have been content to find 20% of Tom's statement true. When she found the entire fence whitewashed, and not only whitewashed, but elaborately coated and recoated, and even a streak added to the ground, her astonishment was almost unspeakable. She said, "Well, I never. There's no getting around it. You can work when you're a mind to, Tom." And then she diluted the compliment by adding, "But it's powerful seldom you're a mind to, I'm bound to say. Well, go along and play, but mind you get back sometime in a week or I'll tan you." She was so overcome by the splendor of his achievement that she took him into the closet and selected a choice apple and delivered it to him, along with an improving lecture upon the added value and flavor a treat took to itself when it came without sin through virtuous effort. And while she closed with a happy scriptural flourish, he hooked a donut. Then Tom skipped out and saw Sid just starting up the outside stairway that led to the back rooms on the 2nd floor. Clods of dirt were handy, and the air was full of them in a twinkling. They raged round Sid like a hailstorm, and before Aunt Polly could collect her surprised faculties and sally to the rescue, 6 or 7 clods had taken personal effect, and Tom was over the fence and gone. There was a gate, but as a general thing, he was too crowded for time to make use of it. His soul was at peace now that he had settled with Sid for calling attention to his black thread and getting him into trouble. I hope you enjoyed this story. I love you, Mama. I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.